in Dr. David Ige. He'll be speaking briefly for 10 minutes and then followed by the next speaker. Please, sir, we would love to have, your speech 10 minutes because of time. Thank you so much. A round of applause for him, please. A round of applause. Let's appreciate him.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this session. Thank you very much for the privilege to speak this afternoon. First of all, I like to acknowledge the excellent keynote speech by Leye. I think that sets the context for this discussion. Actually, Leye is one of our worthy exports as a country. And I think we're very proud of him and his twin brother. If not that I knew Leye very well, I would have said that he saw my presentation first before writing his speech. There's a significant amount of similarities in what we're going to say, and that points to the fact that the issues at stake are very, very, they've clearly well understood. So I'll run through some slides. This is particularly important because a lot of the discussions about LNG in Africa, on Africa, relates to the exportation of LNG out of Africa. This conversation about energy security looks inwards and looks inwards in the context of LNG. This is probably one of the very few forum in which this discussion is actually taking place because most of the discussions are externally focused. So what exactly does energy security mean? It talks about availability, accessibility, affordability, and acceptability. So when we look at Africa and we're talking about energy security in the context of LNG, bear in mind that LNG itself, although it's gas, but coming from liquid first before being converted to gas, right, there's an extra hurdle which actually impacts on its availability and its affordability. And if we're not very clear in Africa as to how do you address those issues, LNG will just sort of be a mirage from a point of view of energy security internally. If you go to the next slide. Possible to take this out? Right. All right. So I'll just go very quickly. I mean, you might have heard a bit of this earlier in the day. There's no doubt about it. Gas is on the increase globally and locally. The new currency for energy is natural gas. And in particular, Africa, if you look at projected gas consumption globally, right, Africa in the next couple of years would amount to about 10% of global gas consumption in terms of natural gas. Now, the interesting thing is that if you look at the projected growth in gas, and I mean, the growth in gas really is driven by a lot of things. The transport sector, the power sector, the data centers, and so on and so forth. So we expect to see significant growth over time. But over that growth, LNG is going to be the most dominant means of transferring gas over the next few years. The growth we're seeing, about 70% of future gas transactions are going to be predicated on LNG. And that's why this conversation is very important. If you look at the global maritime routes, it emphasizes that. Like almost everywhere you go, you turn around, there are vessels moving around carrying LNG. And that just points to the fact that the new world order is gas. And as pipelines begin to diminish, so to say, right, you're going to see a lot more movement of gas across the waters like this. So this points to the fact that globally, LNG is really on the increase, and it continues to be so. Next slide. Now, again, this is where Bite and I, Leye and I sort of speak the same. There's the African conundrum. So I've said earlier, gas is the way, globally and in Africa. But in Africa, you can see that in terms of per capita consumption, Africa is right there at the bottom, right, compared with everywhere else in the world. Now, the conundrum of it is that if you look at Africa as well, virtually all, just like Leye said, virtually all the coastal countries of Africa are now potential LNG exporters. So you can see in the past, if you looked at this picture 3 years ago, all you'll see here would have been Nigeria and Algeria, and probably Egypt. But today, virtually every coastal African country has a plan to export LNG. So you've got this conundrum where per capita consumption of energy internally is the lowest in the world, but globally, we're about the 20% exporters of global LNG. About 140 million tons per annum of LNG will be exported out of Africa over time, right? So how do we then start this conversation, right, such that the African LNG internal story also works? Next slide. What exactly is infrastructure in the context of LNG? Because that's what we're talking about. I think we mentioned it, Leye mentioned it, right? But this is very important because we cannot talk about financing in isolation of the totality of infrastructure for LNG. LNG is not just a gas business. It is 50% logistics business. And Leye mentioned that very, very aptly. I thought it was important to share this because I've spent the last 1 to 2 years chasing the marketing of LNG across Africa. And it's very clear to me that if we do not understand and address LNG holistically, Africa is going to miss the boat in terms of adoption of LNG for economic growth internally, right? And that's the reason why we're looking at this. LNG infrastructure, apart from the production of the LNG itself, at the point of consumption, there's a significant amount of infrastructure work with the shipping itself, because you don't just move LNG in normal ships, right? So there's dedicated ships, so that's number one. Number two is the port itself. Not every port can receive an LNG vessel, certainly not in Africa. Right, and so when we talk about infrastructure, we're not only today talking about just gas infrastructure. We're talking about a major part of non-gas infrastructure, all of which have to be co-financed for there to be bankability and capacity to raise finance. You cannot raise finance if you have the LNG plant, you have the consumption, but you do not have the facilities to receive it. It's not bankable, basically. So that's one of the things. And of course, you have the receiving terminals which have to be built. Now, these terminals globally are built to receive these large-scale LNG tankers. As you'll find out, and as I'll be emphasizing shortly, most African countries are not in a position to consume the kind of capacity of LNG a typical ship will bring. Right, so you have this dilemma as well in terms of the size of the facilities. But normally when you have the storage, these tanks, like Leye also mentioned, these tanks cost multi-millions of dollars to put in place. Then you've got the regas facility, but then once you regas the gas, it needs to go by rail, by road, by pipeline to the point of use. For us to be able to raise finance, all of this have to be financeable, bankable, and aligned. The problem in Africa is that typically along this chain, these connects are not there. And it's important then, what are the enablers that we have to address to achieve these things in order to make sure that LNG is bankable for Africa and can work? Because if it's not, you cannot raise finance. And if you cannot, then we miss this LNG evolution, and the true benefit of gas for internal use is going to be lost. So let's recognize that. I've talked about the exporters being the coastal countries, but a lot of countries in Africa are landlocked inside. They're not exporters of LNG, and they need the gas as well. So I'll conclude with the next slide, which talks what are the key things that we need to be looking at, right? Because Africa needs to think differently. If you look at global consumers of LNG in Europe and so on, these are countries that are massive consumers. So on their own, country by country, they can consume the gas. And even if they cannot consume, and even if they have to connect to the other countries internally, there is an established network of infrastructure that connects them. So you can put gas into Belgium, and that gas can get into Italy, it can get into Spain, it can get into France, and so because there's an interconnected pipeline network, right? But you do not have that in Nigeria. So what are the issues that I think we need to deal with? The first one is demand. Demand in Africa is still subscale. There are not too many places in Africa that have energy-intensive, bankable, credible offtake that can baseload the investment in LNG infrastructure that we're talking about, right? Bear in mind that if you're spending so much money to build an LNG terminal, that has to be predicated that there's enough throughput to justify that investment. I'll give you an example. South Africa has been trying to build a receiving terminal at Richards Bay. And now, clearly, South Africa is one of the biggest countries in terms of consumption in Africa. But they've not been able to do that because there's not enough credible, bankable, internal offtake to baseload the investment in that terminal. Basically, you need to be assured of like a 3 gigawatt power plant as an anchor, right, to be able to baseload the investment in the terminal to do that. They've not been able to do that easily, and that's why they've not reached FID, among other factors. So the question is, in Africa, how do we crystallize the demand, right, that is big enough, credible enough, and bankable enough to underpin those infrastructure that would allow LNG to be received and taken inland to all the countries? There might be need for the government to consider legislation. So take, for example, in China, right, the inland boats that are going around are being mandated now to convert to LNG. Now, that's a government policy to crystallize some kind of, the driver is not necessarily demand, it's more environmental. But, you know, governments in Africa, for example, need to start to look where you have big consumption like the mining sites across Africa or so on. Maybe there's need to legislate a certain amount of gas consumption, right, or incentivize gas. So you have a base load across the continent that can base load massive investments in receiving infrastructure at the coast, right? And of course, the FCTA provides an opportunity for that kind of stuff. The other thing has to do with intergovernmental alignment, because when you bring LNG, recognize that a lot of the inland demand centers are away from the coast, and LNG only comes to the coast, basically. So it means that infrastructure largely is located in the coastal countries. Now, to get things across from there into the inland countries means that there has to be complete intergovernmental alignment. And so I'll give you an example. The copper mines in the Congo, right, need to be exported out through Angola, right, where you have a coast, right, and take that. But then you need, so there they've actually built a railway network that takes gas all the way from Lobito in Angola inland to Kolwezi in Congo, right? But, you know, as they go, when you get to the border between Congo and Angola, there are a lot of, you know, issues, intergovernmental customs and all sorts of things and so on. Now, LNG logistics, right, is predicated on a seamless flow, right? Because you cannot bring LNG from one end and then somewhere in the logistics chain there's a break and you can't get to the point of use, and then you start to have contractual breaches and so on and so forth. So it is necessary for there to be intergovernmental alignment in Africa in order for us to make sure that we couple all this together. Port infrastructure, many ports are not ready for LNG. There are differing standards in terms of how to handle hazardous fluids like LNG at the port. The port charges and the port tariffs are such that if you apply them to typical bulk LNG, the landing cost of LNG inside Africa will be uncompetitive, and then will make LNG not available in Africa. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done. Of course, there's price. LNG is typically indexed to global markets like Brent, TTF, and so on. Now, these prices tend to be volatile. A lot of industries in Africa are not set up to cope with volatility in pricing, right? And so when we bring this together, right, it's important that we begin to think in Africa what kind of price terms, what kind of local price indexations we'll use to underpin investments there. And of course, overall interagency alignment. we'll find out that some standards are acceptable in South Africa, not acceptable in Congo, not acceptable in Nigeria. We need to harmonize standards so that when you're able to export from Nigeria or wherever into Congo, wherever, the standards for acceptability are uniform, and that way we can move stuff. So unless these things are addressed, it is very likely, next slide, it's very likely that Africa may miss out on this. So as we talk about finance, I just wanted, the key takeaway here is that LNG is here to stay. It is a big enabler of economic growth and so on. But we must bear in mind that today's LNG industry is predicated on large-scale exports. It's predicated on countries with large demand and countries that have interconnectivity. Africa is none of those. Africa is neither a large-scale consumer. It is neither one where individual countries themselves are large. When I say large consumers, they may be consumers, but in terms of bankable consumers, basically. And Africa certainly is not as interconnected with infrastructure as will be required to allow LNG to flow inwards. So if we're to truly benefit from the LNG revolution, there's a significant amount of work that needs to be done in Africa. And that's why this session, or sessions like this, are important, because they begin to catalyze that discussion and bring all the relevant partners and agencies together in beginning to bring that alignment. I hope that that gives a bit of context in the discussion about LNG and its applicability internally to Africa versus the normal export potential of LNG. Thank you very much.